Mein Thema heute Abend ist
My topic tonight is from second life vehicle to energy storage in buildings. Two things that at first glance don't have much to do with each other. But if we look closer, there is in fact a certain amount of overlap. So let's start by having a look at how that came to pass.
Kleiner Überblick, worüber ich sprechen werde.
A brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'll start by explaining some of the parameters for environmental influences while spelling out their significance for resources. Then I'll go on to the subject of car refurbishment, specifically the electrification of a multivan that we've undertaken. Then the overlap I mentioned between vehicle and building, which results in building energy storage, and at the end I'd like to touch on the building energy of the future.
Gebäudeenergie der Zukunft. Genau, die Kenngrößen.
I've been thinking about the parameters for the environmental influences, and in the previous talks the big negative we want to fight against has also become ever clearer. That we don't cause the environment too much damage. First and foremost via CO2 emissions. That's what usually comes up first and what we all need to be aware of.
CO2-Emissionen. Das ist irgendwie so der Teufel, der immer genannt wird. Das ist das, worauf alle achten sollen. Dafür gibt es Ideen. Das ist ein
And there are ideas, like a contingent per citizen that can be consumed. And that's the top priority, reducing the greenhouse effect or improving it in future.
Halt zu verringern oder das sogar zu verbessern wieder in Zukunft, dass man da halt deutlich einspart.
But if you look more closely, you find that there are other climate gases, as we call them, or other air pollution, which means that the subject of air pollution itself is an important topic, an important variable, and a way of measuring the environmental impact caused by each of us on a daily basis.
Messen zu können.
The next point is intrusions in the landscape. It's precisely the kind of catastrophic flooding we've seen recently that shows us what happens when we straighten rivers with the aim of going after raw materials. We're intervening very seriously in our world as a whole, and that is ultimately to our disadvantage and to nature's disadvantage generally. That can clearly be measured in terms of energy consumption. When we consume energy, we have to create it somewhere. There are the least invasive forms, solar and wind, but there something always has to happen beforehand. We have to produce something that converts the energy that comes from the sun into the electricity we need and consume. Or fossil fuels. It goes without saying that if we use oil, then that's a major influence on the environment.
Das ist natürlich ein unheimlicher Umwelteinfluss. Ups, ein zu viel. Dann der Wasserverbrauch.
Water consumption, although I'd put it in inverted commas because we don't use water in the classic sense. Water will always be there, but we pollute it and ultimately we change the water quality and contaminate it, or at least it's no longer in the form we need to consume it. And this last point is more marginal, but in some areas very important. Noise pollution caused by shipping is an enormous problem for marine life. Whales are dying, almost committing suicide, because they can't orientate themselves properly thanks to all the ships up there on the surface. That's another issue.
Orientieren können durch die ganzen Schiffe da oben. Also das ist auch ein Thema. Jetzt sieht man, ich habe hier so einen wunderschönen Kreis.
As you can see here, I've created a beautiful circle, which has in the middle what is responsible for all these individual parameters, namely the processing of material resources. If you think about how CO2 is created, there always has to be something there first, made of carbon, which then reacts with oxygen, thus forming carbon dioxide. Just like with air pollution, something that must have been there materially beforehand has to be emitted. And you can carry on through the whole circle, and over again we observe that this processing of resources is what causes all the trouble.
Letztendlich beschert. So. Und diese Ressourcen?
First and foremost, we need these resources enabled to produce wonderful new things for ourselves. I've taken a forklift as an example here, which is a pretty neutral product, no one feels offended. Here we can see all the things we need to make one. Just as an example, we need iron, coal, in most cases oil, aluminium, gold, even though it's not jewelry, there's a lot of gold in the electronics, copper, of course, cotton or something similar for the upholstery, and lots of chemicals. So we need an awful lot of resources to manufacture a forklift. It would be much better if we had a natural resource called forklift and it could be used to make forklifts. But that obviously doesn't work. That's why we have to use and waste lots of resources in order to create one small thing at the end. And then we need natural energy. I've used solar cells here, even though in many cases other forms of energy are used. We need water, of course, as I mentioned, and then the whole production process creates exhaust gases. CO2, greenhouse gases, all the things we don't like. And then what we often forget is that when we produce something, it has to be transported in some form or another around the world. And then the whole cycle starts again from scratch. For the production of these means of transport, we need more resources, energy, and ultimately we create more air pollution, all in order to have a new product at the end of the process. I just wanted to say briefly, I don't know if anyone recognizes the symbols we're using here. Does anyone know them? No? They're from Civilization 5. Maybe some of you might know the early versions. In Civilization, it was always really important to have lots of resources. Otherwise, you'd be more or less lost before you'd started. And back then, at least that's what I experienced, in the early parts of the game, if you got off to a bad start and got stuck at the wrong end of the world, you didn't have a chance. And so you hit the restart button pretty quickly. We can't do that, unfortunately. We humans get born somewhere in the world and then have to live with it, unless we immigrate to another country. In Germany, we've been pretty lucky, you could say. We used to have loads of resources. In the meantime, we've used most of them up, but thanks to our connections worldwide, we've been able to get hold of the resources we need. But last year showed that that also has its limits. Steel, for example, at one point. But even in our company, we had problems getting the semi-finished products that we needed. There simply weren't any. There were supply problems, and with wood products it was exactly the same. Paper was a major topic at the book fair. The publishers had huge difficulties getting their books printed. Then there were amusing things like this. In the building industry, there was a shortage of pipes of a certain size, 120 millimeters, I think it was, that you need in every house that's built for wastewater and drain pipes. And that size was completely unavailable, and people had to switch to pipes that were either too large or too small if they wanted to get their houses finished. And yet they knew at the same time that the whole sewerage system was going to be a dog's breakfast. The pipes might well get blocked because the water flowed too slowly through big pipes, or they were too small to handle the water. You just couldn't get them. And as regards water, here in Germany we're blessed with an excellent drinking water supply, so that only gets half crossed out. But we all know what the situation is in other parts of the world.
Von unserer Seite erstmal nur einen halben Strich durch, aber wir wissen ja alle, wie das an anderen Orten der Welt aussieht. So.
Okay, let's go to the vehicle. Just now it was a forklift, but a car has greater meaning for most of us, so let's have a look at what's inside. For this multivan, we need 70 tons of resources to produce the vehicle. That's a huge amount if you consider that at the end there are just 2 tons left. 68 tons get lost on the way. Then there's the 5 to 10 tons of CO2 that are emitted just in the manufacturing process. The car hasn't driven a meter, and we've already used 5 to 10 tons of CO2 and 20,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. That's the same amount of energy as is used in a house by a family of 4 over 4 years. All that for a car that hasn't even moved yet. We can quote other figures, like the 400,000 litres of drinking water that are also used in one way or another. These are huge amounts, and no one tells us about them. That's hidden behind this red curtain on the right. If we open it, that's the VW factory, the biggest factory in the world. Of the 10 biggest factories worldwide, 3 are car companies. That means there's an enormous amount of industry needed in order to make the cars that we love and above all love to have. Okay, and this is what's happening at the moment. We have the old combustion-engined cars that we want to replace with green electric vehicles. That's a great idea, but as we can see here, it just substitutes one new problem for an old one. And the new vehicles with electric motors are also creating a new problem. So the new electric cars are more part of the problem than the solution. That means we have to do things differently and see what that brings. At the beginning, I talked about this circle with the different environmental influences, and there's some saving in CO2 emissions and air pollution and some noise pollution, but because we don't tackle the resources in the middle, we can't really change anything. My original company, which was involved in aircraft construction, our main client was Airbus, also dealt with this topic. In the aircraft industry, refurbishment is a very common phenomenon, and we also know it from home. We don't throw away our flat or house after 5 years. We renovate or redecorate. We redo the interior. And exactly the same thing is done with aircraft. After about 15 years, they undergo a thorough refurbishment. The complete cabin interior is stripped out and replaced. They replace the jet engines, the cables, sometimes the entire onboard computer system, and then the plane can fly for another 15 years without difficulty. Sometimes we get on a plane which looks brand new, but it isn't. It's actually got quite a few years on the clock, but it's also been regularly refurbished. And this idea isn't based on ecological considerations, but purely economic ones. Planes are really expensive, and the airlines want to keep them in service for as long as possible. But aircraft have to look good for the customers, which is why they're modernized regularly. There is, however, an ecological secondary aspect, because in this way we do actually save on resources too. And we transferred this concept to our new company and said, we can do this with cars too. Why should we dump them when the government comes up with a new eco-bonus? Sometimes they're only 5 years old. Why throw them away when we can do the same thing with cars as what we do with planes? We take the car, do a refurbishment, replace the interior and some exterior parts according to the customer's wishes, and at the same time undertake a so-called electrification. Out goes the combustion engine and in goes a new electric motor. Of course, it's not quite as easy as the slide behind me implies. Sadly, we haven't invented a magic machine where the car goes in one end and comes out the other. But after the rebuild, I'll go into more detail about how we do it in a moment, we've saved 80% of the grey energy and 60 tons of resources. As I said earlier, it takes about 70 tons to produce a new car. We have a quite low component weight. We calculate about 10 tons, meaning we save 60 tons. You can see it here. I'll go through it quickly. Many of you will already know this slide if you've seen this or one of my other talks before. I just wanted to dip into it briefly and explain how it works. So, we start with a vehicle with a damaged engine. Then we remove the engine and all the other superfluous parts, the tank, the exhaust, etc. Then we put the electric motor in, which is much smaller. The scale is more or less accurate in the pictures.
Dann brauchen wir Teile, die diesen Elektromotor natürlich in die Position bringen, wo sein soll.
Then there are the batteries. They're put in the underfloor of the car, where there's now lots of room, where the tank and the exhaust used to be. Then we replace the components that are completely corroded, and in the interior too, if there are any fittings or components that need replacing. Right, so in the end we have a vehicle with a new life. And we can think about how far we want to go with the refurbishment according to what the customer wants. If they say, well, I'd like to keep as much as possible of the original car, I don't need this or that, or we can go as far as putting on new seat covers and so on and so forth. And this is what it looks like. This is the power module that we put under the bonnet.
in den Motorraum reingesetzt wird. Also wir haben etwas.
And we've taken this idea further. The idea didn't come from us, by the way. There are other rebuilders in Germany who've been doing it for years, replacing combustion engines with electric motors. But they tend to do it on an individual basis, whereas we say we'd like to equip car repair workshops with the means of rebuilding cars for local customers. We would just supply the modules with which they can then electrify the cars.
Mit dem die dann halt dieses Fahrzeug elektrifizieren können. Bedeutet also der Motor.
That means the engine, the old combustion engine and various other components are removed. There's a video on YouTube where you can see how the entire module you see behind me is inserted into the vehicle from underneath. It's just a matter of loosening 4 bolts, because this is the old engine carrier, so nothing has changed there. With the same 4 bolts, it's then attached and integrated in the vehicle, which is no different to what happens with the combustion engine when the car is on the production line. There they talk about marrying the engine and the chassis. The engine on the unit carrier is inserted from below, and we take the same route. Right, here we have a cross-section of the whole vehicle. We see the power module at the front, and in the underfloor we have the so-called battery module. That's modularized too. We have a complete module containing a certain number of batteries. They can be upgraded at a later date. I don't have to say, I'll take the whole operating range. I can say, I'll take 3 battery packs to start with at 18 kilowatts each, and then at any time I can say I'd like to extend the range a bit.
18 Kilowattstunden und kann dann jederzeit noch sagen, ich möchte aber noch ein bisschen Reichweitenerweiterung haben. Das machen die Automobilhersteller natürlich wieder nicht.
Car manufacturers aren't interested in offering this. There's a funny story about Tesla which was picked up in the press. When some places had to be evacuated due to Hurricane Irma, Tesla sent their customers a code on their phones, which they entered, and then for a certain period, the cars had an extended range, although the battery hadn't been replaced with a larger one or anything. It was simply that Tesla had activated the extension. That means that every Tesla car has this potential maximum range, but the customers haven't bought it. That may seem pretty smart at first glance. They can say, great, all we have to do is keep producing the same car, and if the customer at some stage decides they want a bigger battery, they can, without having to take the car in. It's just that this way, loads of resources are wasted because they're in the car without being used. And nowadays there are whole electronics packages, not just batteries. The lights on new cars are often pre-assembled for all possible options, and you just go to the Audi or whatever app store and buy a lighting package, and you can suddenly configure different colors.
Und schwupp wundert man sich, dass man jetzt andere Farben einstellen kann. So.
As I say, from the manufacturing point of view, that's great, because at some point they just have to keep making the same car. But right now, when we're trying to minimize the use of resources, it's a catastrophe. Right, here we see the finished product, which means we can do without all the additional industry that I mentioned at the beginning. If we said, let's replace all the conventional combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles, then we don't need the auxiliary industry that would otherwise be necessary. And if we look at this picture again, we can honestly say that we've achieved a huge reduction in all areas. Here we can see a few more examples of applications and the service we offer. At the top we see the first prototype. The first vehicle was constructed a bit differently. It was a multivan that we converted to an electric vehicle mainly for private users. Then comes the subject of fleet conversion. In other words, we don't just do T5s or multivans. From a certain number of vehicles upwards, we can make this conversion module for municipal and other large companies so that they can convert their fleets themselves. We could build a couple of prototypes so that in the longer term they can do the conversion and maintenance in their own workshops.
Ich sag mal, die Umrüstung und die Wartung letztendlich dann langfristig selber machen können.
At the bottom, we can have a little look into the future, what we're planning to do next. This is a conversion of an old van into an eco-camper, as we call it. It's a day camper, not really a mobile home in the sense of having a pop-up roof. It just has a small galley and a fridge and a nice seating area. But in back, we can really say we're teasing out the full potential. We have a really old van that nobody would really want anymore, and we try to make it as attractive as possible so that people say, wow, now I've got a really nice interior and an electric motor, and something that isn't on the market in any form at the moment. Always with the thought at the back of our minds that we try and approach things as sustainably as possible. I mentioned at the beginning that we've made the jump from car to building, mobile to immobile, as it were. One moves, the other doesn't. But you could well ask, why are you doing that when other companies aren't? There are the car manufacturers, and there are the energy suppliers, and the companies who make the equipment. Well, we found overlaps which suggest that we use these two elements which have such a strong influence on our lives. We want to be mobile with our cars, and we also want to be static in our homes. But both are currently in a state of electrification.
Aber bei beiden findet gerade eine Elektrifizierung statt. Das heißt, bei den
I've explained in some detail what happens with the cars, and the same thing happens with the houses. Most of you here today already know that we're putting fossil forms of energy behind us and turning to electricity, ideally created by our own solar panels. And this in turn creates a great demand for energy storage, because in a house, the energy we create isn't always available.
Die Energie, die wir dort erzeugen, die steht uns ja leider nicht immer zur Verfügung. Wir haben ja dann nachts.
The sun doesn't shine at night, and if we take our energy from the wind, there are times when there isn't any wind. So at night and in windless periods, we need stored energy if we don't want to be forced to fall back on fossil energy sources.
Ja, sage ich jetzt mal, fossilen Energiequellen.
Yes, and the whole concept can be seen under the terms smart vehicle and smart home. In both cases, we are to a great extent digitalized and technologized. And all these overlaps offer the opportunity to connect the two. As Felix mentioned earlier on in his talk, we can take the batteries from the car and build them into the storage facility in the house. There'd also been some criticism from people who said, OK, you're doing electric conversions, but what do you do with your batteries when they've reached the end of their lives? That's hazardous waste. And we said, that's true. Let's try and create something that we can give an extended life cycle to. It's not a life cycle in the sense that we can complete the circle, because we don't deal with the recycling at the final stage, but we are trying to prolong the life cycle of the batteries as much as possible. And our approach is to deploy the batteries from the car in our homes in future.
Dann zukünftig in unsere Heimspeicher einbauen können.
As Felix just said, it's about 10 years or so. As regards the lifetime, it depends, but because we already have used vehicles, maybe after only 5 years, people could say, the car's on its last legs, I'd like a new one. And we would have a solution that said, OK, but the batteries are still in good shape. Let's put them in the home storage facility. We could maybe give a kind of guarantee whereby we say, we'll buy the batteries back for a certain price because we can still use them. Or the customer could say, OK, I'll integrate them in my home storage system. The clever thing is that the batteries have to work very hard in the car, but in domestic power storage, the electricity flow is much weaker. So even a battery with a relatively low performance can be employed very usefully at home. Right, this is a very important point, that we prepare the batteries in the vehicle in such a way that they can then also be used in the home storage system as well. You can see that here. This is a so-called hexagon storage unit in the shape of a honeycomb.
In Wabenform. Man sieht hier die.
You can see the control devices at the front and at the back of the battery cells, as we also have them in the vehicle. What sets this apart from other energy storage units is that all the devices are already integrated in it. It's a standalone appliance. We can start with 18 kilowatts. As I said, each module is 18 kilowatts. And then we can go up to 4 times 18, which is 72 kilowatts per unit. And we can also cascade them. We can combine them with other storage units. I'll come to that in a moment. One important factor is that we won't have any returned batteries for another 5 years. So at the moment we're using factory seconds and second life batteries. I could tell you a few interesting anecdotes about them in the car industry, but we're running out of time. How they're discarded from the manufacturing process. They're really meant for scrap, but we can get hold of these second life or B batteries and build them into home storage units, which already makes them sustainable to a certain extent.
Heimspeicher einbauen, sind damit also auch schon ein ganz schönes Stück nachhaltig. Genau, das ist der.
Yes, here we have our prototype as it looks at the moment. Right now we're in the extended prototype phase. Okay, let's quickly go through the application cases. If we take just one storage unit, that's between 18 and 72 kilowatts, that's more for a detached house or a block of flats. If you take several, you only need a control unit in the first one, the other 2 are just slaves, and then we're up to 216 kilowatts. That's enough for a small farm or something like a small tourist business, and we can go on up to 500, around 500 kilowatts. That would be enough for larger storage units in solar power stations or solar plants.
Solarkraftwerken oder Solaranlagen dienen kann. Klassischer Anwendungsfall.
The typical application is the connection to the house. That's what we concentrated on first, but at the moment we're seeing that there's demand everywhere.
Vorhanden sind.
That pretty much speaks for itself, and I think everyone knows that. The only difference is that our storage units are outside and not in the basement and can thus have a direct connection to the vehicle. They also work as a kind of wall box, which means you can feed the stored energy straight into your car. Otherwise it comes from the solar cells, goes into the storage unit, and if needed, into the house or the car too, if desired. Okay, time for a little look into the future, as I promised at the beginning. We're in the middle of preparing a research project where we say we want to connect everything up. Let's do a second life electric car, maybe a Golf as we see here. We've also got an Audi A2 we might use as a mobile home storage unit. So the car would be available during the day to go shopping. Let's say the family has 1.5 cars and we take the half car and use it mainly as storage. But it could also be used to go shopping or for the kids to go somewhere or whatever.
In erster Linie als Speicher, aber kann halt auch verwendet werden, mal kurz zum Einkaufen zu fahren oder die Kinder fahren damit durch die Gegend oder was auch immer. So, und das ist halt dann dieses große.
And that all comes under the banner of bidirectional charging, which has been mentioned here several times in conversation. And the overall direction is towards smart homes, as I mentioned earlier. The car and the building have to communicate with each other somehow to be able to say, OK, you've planned to drive a longer distance tomorrow, so I won't empty the buffer completely tonight. Instead, I'll leave you 400, well, not 400 with such a small car, let's say 200 kilometers for tomorrow, and take the electricity for tonight from the grid. OK, that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting.
Ja, ich hoffe, war einigermaßen interessant.
Vielen, vielen Dank, Henning.